So my name's Andrew Morgan. I'm grateful to the folks here at CyberFox, and Liz, thank you for letting me moderate today and for bringing this thought leadership to all MSPs. Before I introduce Beau, this webinar is really around, at a high level, we call it breaching the cloud, but we're really going to focus around the Microsoft stack, because this is really where, as MSPs and the SMB, we see really the threat actors taking footholds and doing some damage. Beau obviously works, up market as well, so he will certainly, on his course from a cloud pen testing perspective, often talk about GCP and AWS. We're going to leave a lot of that out and most of that out today because it's really not that applicable. Conceptually, a lot of it is still applicable, if that's fair, Beau.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then, Liz, could we put up a poll to get everybody, as I set the stage here? We'll put up two polls. This is the first one for you. We have both polls right there. We can do them. It's a twofer, and then we'll be done with polls, and we'll get some understanding of who's in the audience and what they're doing or not doing. There's no judgment here. It's just really to get a sense for Beau of what folks are doing in terms of pen testing in the cloud. All right, so let me set the stage here. I've mentioned this, Ben mentioned the cyber call. I mentioned this on the cyber call and some other communities that I run. And that is, I was really intrigued reading through CrowdStrike's 2023 Global Threat Report. I think they do a really good job. Number one, it's very, condensed, Beau. That's one thing I like about them. They're not verbose. It's not 400 pages or 200 pages. They really get at the heart of the issue and probably summarize everything in 30, 40 pages. And what really stands out is the increase in initial access, or access brokers, as they call it, to the extent of a 112% increase. And, I wanted to discuss with you, Beau, and have you on because, not only are threat actors and the whole ecosystem becoming highly specialized, right? I mean, it's no longer you do all things. It's you become very good at one thing, you make money at one thing, you hand it to the next person, and they do their thing really well. And we've got this ecosystem, this very efficient, very efficient supply chain. And so they also made note, Beau, specifically how they've been leveraging, Microsoft 365 and Azure resources to do a lot of their damage. But it's interesting that they've moved, and we're going to talk about this, some of how their TTP, some of their tactics in the past year. So in order to, kind of stay with the theme of CyberFox, who their Auto Elevate product is really around, prevention of lateral movement and as a PAM product. Knowing that's a lot of the bread and butter once a threat actor gets in, I thought it was relevant to bring you on. So that's the backdrop of today. And with that, Beau, how about tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do there at Black House?
Yeah, sure. Here, maybe I'll just share the slide real quick so I can read it. Let's see. Let me share my screen. That'll make it a little easier, I think.
Yeah. And let's throw up those results, Liz, if we wouldn't mind, while Beau's talking through this so he can see those.
So I got my About Me slide here for you guys. So
perfect.
I am Beau Bullock. Oh, went too far there. So I work at Black Hills Information Security. I've been here for 9 years now. It's been quite a journey from, much smaller company to what we are today. But basically, I have carried out a number of different types of penetration tests over the years, and have kind of culminated with doing primarily just red team assessments and cloud assessments now. So I'm in kind of like an interesting R&D kind of world where I am constantly just researching the latest threats to organizations. I teach a class called Breaching the Cloud, where I teach you how to hack cloud environments. And like I said, a lot of the content from today's webinar comes straight from my class. But yeah, that's basically it. And it's funny, like you were talking about the report and how You said it was, what was it, 100? What was the number you said, the percentage of increase?
100. So it's 112% increase in
112%.
access broker activity, bro.
Yeah, so that number actually kind of surprises me a bit because we've been leveraging credentials in some context for initial access for years, and like 7 years ago. So one of the tools you see it listed here, Mail Sniper, a tool I wrote, like it was like 7 years ago now. That was a tool to compromise credentials for OA and to use it to search OA. And it's one of the tools that like the FBI has called me and John Strand being like, hey, so tell us about a little bit more about this tool, because we're seeing threat actors actually use this to steal data from organizations. So I mean, it's not new in any context of leveraging credentials. And it's I think the way in which they're stealing credentials and also how they're using them now is different, right? So we're, in a world now where I think, M365 is really the brunt of where the attacks are. And that's why, like, we're not talking about AWS, we're not talking about GCP today, mainly because the attack surface we see from the offensive side, attacking multiple customers around the world. The majority of customers are leveraging things like Microsoft 365, primarily because the productivity suite is integrated, right? Yeah. So you have SharePoint, Outlook integrated already. So why not use the infrastructure side, like Azure as well, when you're already subscribing to these productivity suites, right? So I think that's why we tend to see more attacks against M365 than the other two in this specific context. So
I think we probably could riff on this a while, Beau, but I think certainly the fact that what you just said about being a productivity suite, and the fact that so much sensitive data now is moved, right, in either they estimate, I think, there was this recent study, I was reading about it today. I forget, I'll think of the source for everybody, but it was saying something to the degree of 60% of organizations move sensitive data, right, in the Office suite. So it's
I can confirm that for sure. So we historically, and this is one of the things that I talk about a lot in my class, is that historically, we used to try really hard to get on-prem access.
Right.
Like we would try to phish users or pivot through, VPN access, getting a shell on somebody's computer within the network to try to identify sensitive data on the inside of a network. But now we just phish somebody, get access to SharePoint, and the data we want is just sitting out in SharePoint.
Exactly. And the other thing that, along with, Ben, we talk about Ben Jones on here, talk about this week after week, but how they've made it, they being Microsoft, on one hand, so easy, right, for us. Like if I want to send something to Vince, who's on here via a OneDrive, hey, Vince, here's this information, here's this link, right? They made it so easy, which is obviously a huge, again, with, they call, security, nice try. No, they made it so easy, right, to share. But that's also, as we always talk about, ease is also typically, give it a click, is typically where we have issues, right, with security, when it's so made so easy.
Yeah, so I see one of the questions real quick that's directed towards me. It says, we're still a Google Workspace shop. I perceive it as being more difficult to penetrate and have resisted a move to O365. Would I agree? So I honestly, like, they're similar in some contexts, but I would say in general, the attack tools that we have available to us are more readily available or readily accessible for attacking M365. That being said, a lot of the same types of attacks, password spraying, phishing, those types of things absolutely directly apply to Google Workspace as well. It's just I would say, like, a little bit more of a hurdle for an attacker to go through the process of setting this up. So a little bit different, not much different attack surface, honestly, though.
Yeah. So, by the way, I love the questions. I wish, it's funny. There was a question on is there a Discord server? So must have a BHIS.
We were just talking about that.
Groupie, follower. So we don't, but if you could just, keep the chat going like you're doing, because I think chat's awesome, to keep the conversation going. I'll keep my eyes as best as possible between chat and Q&A. So if you have questions, please try to send them up to questions versus chat, if you will. So Beau, you're hitting right on kind of where I wanted to start things off, which is, although if I could just ask this one more thing regarding the CrowdStrike report. It said more actors are seen moving toward cloud account. So this is the part that maybe is a head scratcher, more toward cloud account discovery compared to heavier reliance on cloud infrastructure the previous year. Does that jive or not based on how your tactics as a pen tester are changing and evolving? Can you talk to us though about that?
Yeah. So the way I understand that, and the way that it sounds like they're vocalizing that specific sentence you just read, is that attackers are leveraging accounts that are not necessarily part of the cloud infrastructure, meaning things like virtual machines, things like databases, things like storage services on cloud infrastructure, which that makes sense to me because we actually talked about it just very briefly before this call, but there is actually a huge difference in account access if you have access to an employee's account that does not have permissions within infrastructure. So the majority of the time where you have like a Microsoft 365 environment, you create an employee, that employee's Azure AD account can do things like access Outlook, can do things like access SharePoint, the productivity suite side of Microsoft. That being said, unless you have explicitly given them rights to go and access things in infrastructure, they won't see anything there, right? So when it comes to account or leveraging an account, we as attackers end up having to leverage the account side more than the infrastructure. If that's the way that we, and actually the next slide was going to be what we
absolutely there. Which is and again, this is where I know we're going to go into this, but maybe before we do, Beau, can you just give us maybe your thoughts on the cloud attack surface, how you see it, if you will, and then we'll go into those two things.
So first up, I would say that in general, we like to look at cloud environments from three different angles. So first off, you have your generic external context, right? Like, so anything that an attacker could glean from your environment or attack externally, think like things that are exposed through a firewall kind of context, right? Things like public storage buckets. That's a big one where, a storage account has been exposed publicly and they have left files out there. That happens. You hear it in the news all the time. Right. The second thing that we try to identify are what I would consider almost like an internal network-based approach to testing. So looking at resource-to-resource access, as well as things like if I compromise a virtual machine, or if I were to find a vulnerability in a web server that you have running on a cloud service, what can I attack from that node, right? So internal to internal resources. And then the third thing, and this is the biggest difference between cloud environments and traditional on-prem networks, is the APIs. So cloud environments have these APIs that allow you to do a ton of collection and analysis of the configurations built around the infrastructure. So for example, if I have like a service principal that I'm authenticating with to an Azure environment, and that service principal has permissions to read configurations from the environment, then you can see a lot of data, things like firewall rules, things like who are the administrators, things like the public accessibility of resources, all the stuff that we're going to talk about in this webinar today. Go ahead.
So Diane, I'm glad you just said what you said, because it kind of interestingly dovetails into Diana's question. And I'm going to kind of tee this up with, on the cyber call this coming Monday, Beau, we're going to have someone, which is Ashley Knowles.
Oh yeah.
on we're going to do attack surface management. And so with that kind of framing out about attack surface and firewall, Diane says would be interested in your thoughts, Beau, on where, if any, a hardware firewall is going to be helpful in M365 cloud account attacks. And so can you kind of correlate this again maybe for us?
Yeah, so I'd say if the organization is leveraging cloud exclusive, right? So if I just go and sign up for a Microsoft 365 account, then there's almost no scenario where a hardware device at all matters. That being said, a lot of the organizations we test are hybrid environments, right? Where you have cloud and on-prem, and then there's connectivity between the two. So, hardware firewalls, things like in any sort of accessibility options around VPNing into a network, those types of things are what I would worry about more than anything, because that is the potential of a cloud account compromise pivoting to connectivity on-prem, right? But other than that, I would say, like, in general, like, the hardware doesn't come into play a whole lot when it comes to the cloud accounts we're looking at.
So good stuff. I just threw in chat to everybody, just give us a Y for yes and for no. Are your clients' environments still primarily hybrid? My suspicion, I know there are some out there that are fully cloud now, but my suspicion is we still have a lot of hybrid out there. Just, hybrid. Yeah, hybrid. Yep. Yeah. So 1 no, 2 no's. Okay. Cloud. Okay. So probably look, give or take as it's coming through, I would say, don't shoot me guys, but gals, 90% or so still hybrid, give or take.
That sounds accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, Beau. So you were headed to the next spot, which is, I think, talking about differences between, and this is often misconstrued, right? Where Azure Resource Manager versus M365. And can you unpack this a bit for us?
Yeah, so this kind of comes back to the question you asked about, attackers leveraging infrastructure versus just an account. And you can have an account that has access to do things productivity-wise, email, SharePoint access, Teams, messaging, that does not have access to infrastructure. And so this is one of the things, like, as an attacker, this is the first thing we check. So if we compromise an account, whether it be through password spraying, credential stuffing, any sort of like phishing around credentials, one of the first things I look at is this account just an Azure AD account, or is this an Azure AD account that has permissions within a subscription within Azure? Because subscription access is where we tend to find more interesting stuff, right? Because that means we now have access to go look at configurations around virtual machines, databases, storage, a lot of the actual infrastructure side of Azure. But a lot of people think that just because you have access to one account means you have access to this stuff as well, which is not the case. There is a segmentation boundary there. It does take having the permissions. So whenever I went to build this deck, I built this presentation around kind of this concept of like a cloud pen test apocalypse is what I call it. So I'm doing another talk at B-Sides Tampa and at Hack SpaceCon in a couple of weeks, called Cloud Pen Test Apocalypse, and it's something that I actually it echoes from one of the very first presentations I ever did called just Pen Test Apocalypse, where basically I wanted to take the top 10 things we were doing on pen tests that we were having success with, and then throw them into a presentation to say, hey, here's all the stuff that we're seeing all the time, all the issues that we're seeing, and here's the stuff that you really probably should be worried about more than anything. And honestly, if you fix these things, then you're probably going to have a pretty good day when it comes to, having an actual security assessment. So anyways, I took a couple of them out of this because they were more AWS related, more GCP related. So you have 8 here today. And we'll try to get through them all. We still have 40 minutes. So
we do, Beau. And can I just ask you a quick question before we go into publicly exposed storage from Dennis, because I think it's a good one. He says, this is from your previous slide. In essence, do you recommend keeping separate accounts for email and infrastructure access? Love your thoughts on that.
So I think that creates a little bit too much to manage, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't want your IT staff to have 2 different accounts just for logging in to do stuff. I mean, it makes it easier from a permissioning standpoint, right? To have a dedicated system for saying, hey, here's an account that is a little bit more privileged, right? And then we can leverage it. I don't know. I don't think necessarily splitting those up is the best, but I could be wrong there.
Yeah. No. It's cool. And so, let's kick things off here, Beau, into publicly exposed storage. Not like even enterprise companies would ever have, valuable information in a public exposed.
No, never.
Right. Yeah.
No. So like this is one of the issues you tend to hear about in the news more than anything else, cloud related, right? Is when you have like a public S3 storage bucket on the Amazon side, but there's also Azure storage buckets. So Azure has its own storage service that's almost identical to S3s, and it's something that ends up getting misconfigured to be publicly exposed. And it could be that maybe the organization has a web application that they're just pulling files from, and they think like, oh, well, maybe this should be public because we have a web app that's just pulling some JavaScript files from it or whatever. And then they end up putting something sensitive in it. Or you have a developer that has enough privileges to expose things on their own, and they accidentally expose a bucket that has a bunch of sensitive data. These types of things happen. And the problem is that us as attackers can discover storage buckets due to the naming around those storage buckets. So when you go to create a storage account in Azure and S3 too, you give it a name, and it has to be a unique name. And a lot of companies will pick their own name, right? So they'll call it Black Hills storage account, right? In my case, right? And for us as attackers, we just then have to use tools that can brute force DNS, basically, because what happens is those storage accounts get predictable URLs. So you go to create this name, right, called the Black Hills storage account. Now you're going to have blackhills.blob.core.windows.net as a DNS name. And so from the outside, this makes it something that we can try to identify. And it's something we do on every assessment now, is just look to see, are there any public storage buckets out there that have any data? So that would be number one. Oh, you're muted, Andrew. Oh, Andrew, you're muted, I think. Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Thank you, Beau. Is it important for us, before we move on, to talk about the concept? You talk about this identity versus resource concept. Is that important for us to just touch on real quick?
Yeah, we can touch on that a little bit. That kind of tends to be more in like the AWS side of things, but it is applicable to Azure too. So one of the things that attackers need to do after getting access to an account is identify what access they have. And in the cloud world, you have ways of applying policies to identities, things like an IAM user, things like an Azure AD user. You also have the ability to apply them to resources directly. So to give you an example, like an S3 bucket like this, or a storage bucket, you could apply a policy to my user that says that user has access to all the storage buckets in an account. And it could be something that I could enumerate just by listing out my own policies, right? My own user policies. But on the flip side of that, you could apply that same policy directly to a storage account and say, hey, storage account, Beau's user account has access to you. So the policy is actually applied to the storage account as opposed to the user. And so why that's important is because as attackers, that creates a moment where we have to enumerate those permissions and policies in the network, and it creates a detectable moment, right?
Got it. So you obviously want to be as quiet as possible, to your point. Makes sense. Okay, let's go to key encryption. The key disclosures.
Key disclosures. Yep. Yes, this is another one that we still see pretty often. It's the concept of basically having a developer or somebody that is writing a piece of code that is managing that piece of code in a public repository. Accidents happen, and sometimes they commit secrets to those repositories. So good example of this would be you have a developer that has a public GitHub repository of their own. Maybe they're just testing some code out, like they're, working at home on the weekend, testing some code out. They included a secret, so like an access key within their repository, and then publish that code. And the thing about code repositories is they track all of the history of the code, right? So even if they go and delete it, if they go in or commit a new version of the code to that repository to remove that secret, that secret would be there in commit history still. So one of the things we do and try to identify is first off, developers at an organization figure out what repositories are tied to those developers, even if they're personal. And then we go search through them with a few different tools that we have available to us, a few different open source tools. And we search them for things like access keys, like in this screenshot here, AWS access keys. And, sites like GitHub have done a lot of work to prevent this type of thing from happening. They actually will scan repositories now on their own too, and will tell you if you've submitted a secret. But there are times where you have things that are like base64 encoded, or maybe you have secrets that are not necessarily like under the same schema or the same, like, I guess, like searchable context that an access key would be. So we still find creds and repos, and then leverage those to try to log in.
Beau, do you foresee all the buzz right now about AI tools like ChatGPT? Could you foresee you with your masterful mind, how you create tools? Could you foresee potentially feeding it some, hey, go scan this repository, and you start to ask it questions to scan that repository?
Yeah, so I don't think ChatGPT can access the internet directly, unfortunately, yet. Or actually, that might be fortunate. Maybe that's a good thing it can't access the internet yet, take over everything. But yeah, I mean, I think so. There are already some tools that can do this type of thing. They're just coded to look for certain strings, right? They're coded to look for things like private keys, things like passwords, things like keys that have common, prefixes, that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, ChatGPT is interesting. It's actually kind of fascinating to ask it for pieces of code specifically. So, and also you can ask it to identify vulnerabilities in code too.
Right.
So like I've seen examples where people have fed it like a CTF challenge that's like a Python script or some piece of code, and it finds the vulnerability like fast.
We had Steve Carter of Nucleus Security, the CEO, on the cyber call, and he was actually mentioning that he sees it's a double-edged sword. It's great for developers to find vulnerabilities, but it's going to be also really great for threat actors to find vulnerabilities. So
oh yeah.
All right. So so yeah, this is one that gosh, I think all MSPs struggle with, whether it's trying to get their clients to work through this, trying to get them to, like, who still struggles, like even getting clients to SSO, passwordless, things of that nature. Go ahead, Beau.
Oh yeah, no, it's so honestly, like, passwords have always been I would say, like the main weakness for the majority of organizations we test, right? And we, through things like phishing, like you have multiple ways of not only getting a shell in somebody's system, but now, we also have tools that help us to harvest credentials in a more efficient manner. They get us around things like MFA as well. But on the actual password policy side of things, the number one attack that we're still using every day is password spraying. And I'm going to show you kind of like how we get to that point. So as an attacker, like if you hired me to test your company today, basically one of the first things I do is go to this very first link at the top. So this login.microsoftonline.com/getuserrealm srf or .srf. You give it the login parameter of a username at an email address, right? So your company's email address, right? It doesn't have to be a valid user, just has to be the right domain. And then you submit that in a browser, and you get a result back that looks similar to this page here. And what this is, it's a mechanism for us to do recon on the type of tenants you have at Azure or in Azure. And mainly, this tells us whether or not, well, first off, if you're a Microsoft customer, or more importantly, if you're leveraging what is known as a managed type of account, where you're leveraging something like password hash sync or pass-through authentication, where the authentication piece is actually being hosted in Microsoft versus something like Active Directory Federated Services, right? ADFS. So this would tell you whether or not the organization is federated or managed. And if it's federated, it would also give us the URL where authentication is actually occurring. So the ADFS URL. So great piece of recon. It's something, open on the internet, publicly available, just a very quick way to understand what type of account an organization is working with. The second link is something that helps us identify a tenant ID. So same concept, right? Where I have target domain and the URL there. If you change that to your domain, you'll get back a result with a long GUID in some of the parameters. That long GUID is the tenant ID. And in a lot of cases, that's not super useful until you have a service principal credential, which has happened. So like in that last case, GitHub repositories, finding creds. One time we had an engagement where we found a cred in a GitHub repository. It was a service principal credential. And we had the client ID and secret. But the thing with service principals in Azure is you cannot authenticate unless you have a tenant ID. So this URL, publicly available URL, was the piece we needed to get that third piece of the puzzle. So after discovering where to actually authenticate from that last URL, right? Like, are we authenticating against Microsoft, or are we authenticating against an on-prem ADFS server? Then it comes down to how are we going to attack users in the environment? And this is a point in recon where we stop and say, all right, well, we need to gather usernames, we need to gather email addresses, we need to do recon around the employees of the organization, build out a good user list, and then we're going to perform what's called password spraying. For those who haven't heard of password spraying before, it is very similar to brute forcing of passwords, where you have a single account where we're trying 10,000 passwords. The problem with that type of approach is that you're quickly going to lock out accounts, right? Because a lot of organizations have lockout policy after 5 attempts, and password spraying flips that whole idea around and says, all right, well, what if I took every single username in the environment and I tried one password against each one of them? And I chose something that fits a common password policy, something like season, year, right? So that is something that we have had tremendous success with over the years. Season, year, password spraying attacks. So like, I would honestly, like, number wise, I would say like somewhere in like the 80 to 90% range of organizations have somebody at that organization that has a password that is like winter 2023, right? With a capital W. It's a 10-character password, has an uppercase, lowercase, and number, fits policies. And if you rotate every 90 days, you can just rotate with seasons.
Beau, by the way, like, on one hand, you have these tools that are very useful for marketing and sales. Like, let's just take, have you heard of Hunter.io?
Yeah.
Like, do you use that again to your advantage?
Yes. Yeah.
And again, so what, if you could flip it around as these MSPs sitting here, trying to educate their customers, trying to, develop better policies with and for their customers, knowing, can you describe for those that don't know what Hunter is, how you'd use it, how you might use it in conjunction with LinkedIn, and so on and so on and so on?
Yeah. So with Hunter, we would use it to gather email addresses primarily, right? Known email addresses. But so one thing I would say is, like, don't focus too much effort on trying to prevent an attacker from getting your employees' names, because that is something that is almost impossible to do, because people want to go on LinkedIn and say where they work. Like, it's just, it's a matter of fact, like, people do it. And so honestly, we still resort to using LinkedIn primarily anyway, to gather employee names, right? And some of them, may not still work there. There's times where we have people that, that aren't legit usernames, right? But all we need is one correct one and a correct spray. Then we can gather the entire user list from the global address list in Outlook. Got it.
Yeah. By the way, since you mentioned, LinkedIn and things like that, Beau, do you also look for things like, hey, I'm the CrowdStrike administrator?
Oh yeah. For sure. Yep. Yeah, so when it comes to targeted phishing, LinkedIn is a really, really good place to identify not only who to phish, but how to phish them based off of the security products they talk about. So, there's times where we'll have like a security engineer that's, working at an organization that says, I'm, 10 years experience in blue coat proxies and, great at managing, CrowdStrike EDR, and we'll have like them basically tell us what it is that their environment is operating under, right?
Right.
And why that's important is because us as the attackers trying to phish that organization, we just go spin up the exact stuff in a test lab, right? And then now we build our fish around the products that they have, at least said they use, and have a better chance of getting around those.
I'd imagine you also might even, if you, from a spear phishing side, you might even say, hey, for, something specifically for, hey, built specifically for CrowdStrike administrators or something like that, that might get them to entice them to.
I have backdoored a security software one time and served it up as a new update to an organization, to a security engineer, like basically phish them with the product they were using,
right?
By just simply backdooring the exact like executable product that they needed to upgrade. Yeah. So yes, that is 100% legit.
Oh, wow. Crazy stuff. Very cool. All right.
Onward. So on the password spraying side, it's kind of evolved over the years. I wrote a tool, I guess a couple of years ago now, called MSOL Spray, which is a tool that helps us to password spray users in Azure. So this is one that we would use to try to identify valid credentials for employees of the organization. One thing that like I love to talk about in this particular slide is that the endpoint, so the actual URL where the authentication occurs for Microsoft, is extremely verbose and will tell you so much about an account. So first off, it'll, if you have a valid password, it'll tell you if it's valid or not, which is nice. But more importantly, it will tell you if that account has MFA or not. And that is super important because us as attackers, if we phish somebody and we go to log into their account and they have like auto texting enabled for MFA, it's like, oh no, I just alerted them, that I have their password. There have been times we've done that and then they just let us in anyway. Seriously. But in most cases, we don't want to alert somebody that we have their credential, right? So this is one of those ways that we can validate a credential without actually triggering the like push notification or MFA process for them. But additionally, this endpoint will tell you things like if the tenant is real or not, or if the user exists. So like if you have users that are not valid, it will tell you if the account's locked, if it's disabled, the password's expired. One of the things that I really like to look at here too is conditional access policies, because it'll tell you a good amount about why your authentication failed, which actually we'll get to the conditional access section here in a second. There are some protections though that I would recommend enabling for sure in the Azure side when it comes to password attacks. The primary one being what's called Azure Password Protection.
I love this one. I'm going to tell everybody to really tune into this, Beau, because this is something that I think MSPs can really benefit from, these two.
Oh, for sure.
Specifically this first one.
Yeah, specifically the first one for sure. So Azure Password Protection, this is so, like I mentioned, like with password spraying, right? There are times where we will have organizations that implement what is known as a password filter, which Azure Password Protection is essentially a password filter. And what that means is that it prevents your employees from choosing certain words in their passwords. So you say, all right, nobody in my organization can pick a season, can't pick a month, can't pick a sports team. You build this list of potential password words that they just can't include in their passwords. And that eliminates spraying capability like immensely, right? Because me as an attacker now, like, I don't have anything to go off of when it comes to like picking something that, one of your users would use other than the location they're at and the season and year, right? It makes it much harder to identify something to spray with. So that's a really big one that can help prevent spraying. The second one, Azure Smart Lockout. So this is effectively a lockout mechanism for locking out an IP that is performing failed login attempts. And the reason this one, like I would say it's kind of secondary. It's good. It's a good like generic prevention mechanism. However, it can be bypassed by rotating IPs. So this is something that we have tools for as attackers to rotate our IPs as we do authentication attempts. It kind of gets around that. But it is still a good protection to have enabled regardless.
So okay. So please go to misconfigurations. This is this one, and this is where conditional access. But can you set the stage? We talk about this a lot in one of the community calls I run at SaaS Alerts, but how Microsoft sets some really good stuff up out of the box and how we break it.
Yep.
And then once we break it, it's kind of the Pandora's box.
Yeah, it's like probably my biggest like pet peeve when it comes to Microsoft is this security defaults. So exactly what you just said, right? Security defaults is actually really awesome. So when you sign up for a Microsoft 365 account, day one, you have a lot of really good stuff enabled by default. You have a requirement that all users register for MFA, right? So that's great. Everybody has to use MFA. More importantly, it blocks legacy authentication protocols, which we'll talk more about those in a second. But that is actually extremely important because that helps prevent access to accounts through other means than the traditional Microsoft portal. Requires MFA during auth when necessary. So if you're accessing an account from a new location, or if there's something suspicious about the login, it will trigger MFA again. And then it protects privileged activities like access to the Azure portal. So the problem is that or the good thing is that this is enabled by default, which is great. The problem is that if you want to have any nuance to those rules, like if you want to create an exclusion, like if you said, I have a CFO or a CEO or somebody that is, needing to authenticate on their phone without MFA, right? Like nobody ever has exclusions for people like that, right? But if you do, right, then you have to disable security defaults and create what are known as conditional access policies. And that the problem with that is like now you've turned off all this good stuff. You not only have to go rebuild it, but you have to make sure that you also create the exclusions correctly. It puts a lot more potential for failure on the admins. So with conditional access, there are fine-grained controls for access to resources. The gist is that you can create these rules that are tied to user accounts, the device they're using to log in, the application they're trying to access, and what is known as real-time risk. And you can determine or decide whether or not you want to apply MFA or just allow the authentication to continue in. And legacy auths is still a thing. It is being disabled. So technically, like Microsoft disabled it earlier this year. However, there is a way to still go re-enable it. So there is still a potential for things like Exchange Web Services, SMTP, IMAP, that kind of stuff getting re-enabled in Azure as well. But the gist of this was that we used to have things like Microsoft Outlook for Mac that could only authenticate over these legacy protocols like Exchange Web Services. So, we had people building conditional access policies that allowed these protocols, right? And the reason it's important is because it's a different protocol altogether and actually has a different authentication location than your traditional just Microsoft Online portal. The other thing that you can create rules around is the device type. So you could say, I want to, like I said, like in the example I said before, allow Android users or iPhone users the ability to authenticate single factor to my tenant. And the way you could do that is by specifying the device in a policy. The problem with it is that Azure judges devices purely off of the user agent string that's being sent from the web request, which is something that we can control as attackers. Here's a good example of it. Real world example too. It's something that we see on pen tests. So on the left, we have traditional Microsoft login portal, right? I'm going to log in and I trigger MFA, right? So it says, we've texted your phone, please enter the code. On the right, I use the built-in developer tools within the browser to change my user agent to an Android user agent, resubmitted the exact same just username and password, right? And I'm into the account, right? Without MFA. So that's a conditional access policy that just says, hey, mobile devices can authenticate single factor.
And those are the kind of tools that you'll use, Beau? Like I think I've heard you talk about MFA sweep to figure out who's using what and how do you exploit that? And there's some questions, but just want you to know, keep the questions coming. I'll at the end bring these all up to Beau. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I can hang out longer too, afterwards. Okay. I don't have to bail super quick.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So with MFA sweep, I wrote this tool after doing just a lot of research around like all these authentication portals, right? So there's the various APIs, first of all. So the Graph API, Service Management API, those are the two main APIs that if you're managing anything on the Azure resource side, like the infrastructure or Azure Active Directory, those are the two APIs you hit. Two different schemas there, right? So you have to worry about how are users authenticating to those. Then we have legacy auth, right? So Exchange Web Services. So this hits the legacy auth checkbox. Then we have the actual web portal, but in addition to that, the web portal using those different user agent strings as well. And then for whatever reason, whenever you create a conditional access policy, there's also a checkbox purely just for active sync. It's not grouped in with the legacy auth protocols anymore. So basically what the tool does is it just tries to authenticate to each one of these portals and determines and tells you whether or not it was able to have success authenticating single factor or not.
Beau, I do want to take one of the questions here. I love Jeff's last question because, a lot of MSPs look at this because it's in a lot of the tools out there, scanning tools and things like that. Or, when I say scanning tools, these tools that are used in sales, if you will. And, they do vulnerability checks. And one of the things they look at is the Microsoft Secure Score. Mm-hmm. And the question from Jeff is, do you feel that's adequate at all? Like, is that representational of maybe good or bad? I'm paraphrasing. He asks good shape. Is Is it denoting good or bad security hygiene around that M365 tenant, or do you think it's a little loose? Is it good? Is it bad?
I think it's a good baseline. I think it's a good baseline, but it's something that I still would want to verify with other tools as well, right? And honestly, like manually too, because like some of the stuff that the security score will find, or that it won't find, I should say, are things like escalation issues between different types of accounts based off of just privilege issues. Like it'll identify, a lot of good stuff like public resources, like the storage buckets I mentioned.
Right.
But I would say I treat it as more like a baseline. But on top of it, look for other things as well.
Okay. Really good advice. All right, my friend, back to your stuff here and sensitive data and file shares.
Yeah. So SharePoint, this is one of the first things we talked about earlier in the webinar, right? Is the movement of sensitive data from on-prem to cloud, and just having this stuff out in SharePoint. One of the things that for years we find sensitive data is just like shares on a network in general. Now it's the exact same thing, but in the cloud, right? So we're finding SharePoint, SharePoint sites that just have, passwords.xls, have, database backups, have, just various like things like VPN certs. I included VPN certs in there for a very specific reason, because I was on a red team assessment where we fished one person, right? Got access to SharePoint. They actually were using an 802.1x based or cert based auth to their VPN. So just having the cred was not good enough, right? We had to have the VPN cert too. And they had a cert sitting out in SharePoint that we were able to just download, install in our system, and the VPN to the network. The other thing that's kind of neat about SharePoint is the search functionality is actually really good too. You go into SharePoint, look in the, start searching around for things like passwords, keys, secrets. A lot of times we'll find stuff there.
Wow. Can you, this is my ignorance, Beau, but can you do any like star, like, hey, give, or any type of almost like, and maybe just if you could talk about Google Docs just for a second, because I don't think everybody knows it. It's almost like, can you put in those types of things and say, return this information?
Yeah. So
two-part question there.
No, you can wildcard searches, but you can also, if you, I don't know, the slide's probably kind of small, but if you look under result type there, you can also filter on different types of files. So you can say like Excel, web page, Word. So that can help kind of, I guess, narrow your search a bit, right? In big SharePoint sites.
Have you found a treasure trove of stuff sometimes when you are getting into environments?
Yeah, for sure. There's times where like you will find the keys to the kingdom in a spreadsheet, right? Like domain admin creds, just everything, right? Just in a spreadsheet. Definitely happens. So
is it appropriate to talk here at all about Google Docs, or are we going to get to that?
So like using like file type calling docx, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like I don't know if everybody knows about that. Just maybe a Y or N, because I think it's really fascinating how you use that, Beau.
So like more on the, I guess, like searching for public files for sure. We tend to use because Google Docs, right? On On the SharePoint side, I would say more just wildcards around certain terms, not necessarily file types as much.
Got it.
We're kind of looking, we're not gonna, I guess we're mainly just looking for the instance of like the word password in every file, right? As opposed to just text files, just XLS files, that kind of thing.
Got it. Cool.
All right, so issue number 6, clear text, creds, and resource configs. So this brings us up to looking at things from the API perspective, right? So like I mentioned earlier, how one of the things we want to do is not only look at resources from the outside, not only look at it from the inside, from like resource to resource perspective, but also from the API, right? And via API requests to cloud infrastructure, just having reader level permissions. So just having the ability to read configurations around resources, not even accessing the resources directly, just the ability to read the configurations can oftentimes glean a lot of sensitive data. And one of the big things that we tend to find are credentials and environment variables. So think like if you have a virtual machine or a function, right? So like a serverless function, where the developer has a requirement for that virtual machine or serverless function to authenticate to something else, right? A lot of times they will use environment variables to hard code credentials effectively. Another thing we often find are things like Slack tokens. A lot of cloud infrastructure tends to get implemented where the cloud service is actually like telling a Slack channel what's going on sometimes, and they'll use Slack tokens, API creds, SSH keys. But oftentimes, like a lot of this stuff shows up in just like effectively what is metadata around resources themselves. Another good example, just a couple weeks ago, I was testing an environment where they were leveraging tags, right? So like just, like resource tags, right? Just things you can name. Like you say like, oh, this is, a development tag that, says like this set of resources is development, right? Like normally you shouldn't find any sensitive data there, right? However, in this particular environment, they hard coded a username and password as a tag, right? And just as a reader, like just being able to read configurations around the cloud environment from the API, we're able to find that.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, runbooks, another commonplace. Find creds. So this is one that requires automation accounts. This is the way to kind of automate things within Azure. A lot of times we'll find creds that are just built into the scripts themselves. All right, issue number 7. I know we're like 5 minutes in, or 5 minutes left.
Yeah, just let us know, folks, if you guys want us to go a little longer, or you need to wrap up at the top, and we can take questions. Just yes or no. Yay, why go a little bit longer, and need to hop off. Okay.
Yeah, I can get through the rest of these, I think, quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, so we only have like a couple more
okay,
issues
perfect.
here.
I'm going to zip it and let you go.
Okay. So lack of patching, right? So it's, same thing that you see on internal networks shows up in the cloud. The big difference is that I would say that a lot of organizations have really good asset management or inventory, if you will, for on-prem stuff, right? Because they physically can tangibly see that stuff, right? And it's like, oh, this goes in my asset management system. One of the things that I see though is that it lacks a little bit when it comes to cloud infrastructure management. So a lot of the same servers that you would normally be patching, the software that's on them internally on-prem is not getting patched as well in the cloud. So we look for things like insecure web applications that have out-of-date software, database services that are publicly exposed, that kind of stuff. So one thing I don't know if we can, let me see if I can just copy this out real quick and I'll throw it in the chat. I have a link here to these cloud pen test cheat sheets that I put together. So these have a lot of the, let's see if I can actually find the chat. Where's that? Oh man, there it is, chat. All right, here, I'm gonna throw this in the chat, okay? And to everyone. All right, so this repository has a ton of like one-liners, if you will, for basically performing different types of like assessments around cloud environments. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's cheat sheets, right? But anyways, this specific slide is showing how you can extract all of the public stuff. So things that could possibly be public, things like public virtual machines, things like DNS addresses around load balancers, databases. So I'd highly recommend at least trying to run some of these to at least see what your potential exposure is in your cloud environment. Because what we do is like, I will run these types of commands, right? Find all the stuff that could possibly be public and then go check it from the outside, right? To see if any of it is actually exposing anything publicly. Yeah, so exactly what I just said, like look for externally exposed web servers, SQL servers, SSH, that kind of stuff. All right, final thing, overprivileged accounts. We'll get through this one real quick. So in Azure, as a tenant, you can have multiple subscriptions. Under those subscriptions, you can have various roles and resources, right? So I can deploy virtual machines, databases, that kind of stuff. And I can apply various roles to those different resources. Where we tend to see issues is around the roles that are applied to groups or users that maybe shouldn't have higher level permissions. And it's oftentimes something that is just it's an accidental mistake of sorts, right? Because there are a ton of different roles in Azure already. Like there's a couple hundred of them. Things like cloud access administrator, user access administrator, application administrator. There's all these different names, right? And each one of them actually have different sets of permissions within Azure. And us as attackers, what we'll do is run a tool like Azure Hound and try to identify paths of escalation based off of the access we have. Service principals. So same thing. There's a couple hundred different service principals the day you sign up for Microsoft 365 tenant. One example of escalation or privilege escalation within Azure is the ability for an account like an application administrator who, by default, application administrators can't create new accounts. They can't, go and create a new user account. However, they can change passwords for applications. And so if you can find an application that has the ability to change or create users, you can change the password for that application with an application administrator, therefore, or thereby escalating privileges effectively. Anyways, that brings us up to the 2 p.m. mark, and we got the top M365 vulns. So just to kind of quickly go back through those real quick. Number 1, publicly exposed storage. 2, key disclosure and repos. 3, weak password policies. 4, conditional access misconfigurations. 5, sensitive data on file shares. 6, clear text creds and resource configs. 7, unpatched and or exploitable resources. And then 8, overprivileged accounts.
All right. Beau, that was fantastic. What do you think, everybody? How about do we get a thumbs up for Beau? Beau, I'm going to try to knock out a few questions here.
I'm going to get a ton of thumbs down, probably.
Now
that you jinxed it, man. Like,
no thumbs down, I don't think. We'll see. But Liz, will this, you might have answered already, will this be available? I'm assuming the recording will be sent out to all registered and attended. If you could just let everybody know in chat, that'd be great. Also, Beau, we got asked about your presentation. Could we get that in a PDF by chance?
Yeah. I can get that. Okay. Actually, I think you have it, right?
You okay with me sending that?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
okay.
Fine.
So I'll send that everybody. I'll send the presentation over to the folks at CyberFox, and they'll get it out to all of you as well. So let me just run through these real quick. Logan asks, can password protection be used if Azure AD Sync is being used to sync from an on-prem AD side to the Azure side?
That's a good question. So I think it would. I think so. I don't quote me on that, but I believe so. Yeah, I think you would have to. Because if you're able to reset a password I think it would enforce a password change on the Azure side. Like if you're have a user that is trying to change their password currently, I think that policy would get enforced if they're doing it through the Microsoft portal. I don't think it would enforce it on-prem though. Don't quote me on that though.
Okay. And then Kenny says, can you use Azure password protection or smart lockout when you have a hybrid setup?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Wes, do you ever target sysadmins with fake job interviews to get intel on their environment? Seems like low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I mean, so not even just to get intel, but with actual resumes, we'll weaponize like payloads as resumes. So like one of the common ruses that we'll use is to create a LinkedIn account that is like a doppelganger of somebody in HR at the organization. And we will, basically copy their entire profile, look just like them, right? And then start up a conversation with somebody like a sysadmin and say, hey, we have a new hire or a potential new hire in your department. Does this application look legit?
Wow.
And then send them a link. Yeah.
Wow. That's very cool. Very, very interesting. All right. Well, that was all the questions, Beau. I put again and I'll put it in here one more time. If you want to take Beau's course online or any of the courses from Black Hills, I highly encourage you to. John Strand, as an example, is teaching core SOC skills next week live. Keep an eye out for Beau teaching live, but you can take his recorded on demand. It's in there now. Beau, as always, man, thank you so much for your time. And I know we're going to hopefully keep seeing lots more of you here in the MSSP space as we pull Black Hills kicking and screaming into this world. And
yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Liz, thank you. Everybody, thank you for joining. Thank you for your time. And until our next session and webinar, we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.